Welcome to part 2 of History of the World. Now, I failed to mention or forgot to mention the advent of metalworking when I talked about the creation of language. So I'm going to touch real quick on that. Also mentioning that in the Amazon basin there was a very large river system, probably or possibly not as well suited to agriculture. Maybe that's why it didn't develop as well. But for the Amazon River Basin and the Mississippi Valley to both not develop agriculture when a lot of other major river systems did. Not all other major rivers, but a lot. Maybe it's because people came too late to North America, and the hunting and gathering lifestyle and traditions and culture was too strong still, and they needed longer to build up the cities thing. By the way, the word horticulture is what refers to. Someone put the comment correctly in the first video. Horticulture refers to finding plants and taking care of them. Now then, from this book, The Metalsmiths, a rather facile time life book, but with some information in it nonetheless, they note that in every case that archaeology has discovered the origins of metalworking in this or that society, always, it is art that is involved. I'm going to have a studio, a soundproof studio, and I don't know when. It may be years from now, but I will have one. There will always be found art involved when you find metalworking in history, and you will always find that the metal begins in small quantities. So when you think of it that way, it's obvious. If your society has an ounce of gold or 7 ounces of copper, you don't make a plow, you don't make a knife. You don't make anything utilitarian. You probably make something for a priest to wear, or the king, or something like that. And that brings one more point about the United States, or pardon me, North and South America is what I meant to say. They didn't have metalworking. Yes, they had gold. The Inca had gold. If you, the Aztecs probably had copper. Certainly, somewhere in the Chilean mountains, they used copper at some point. But oddly, when Columbus got there, they didn't have much of anything, not even gold. A lot of that, on some scale they had a good amount of gold, but the Europeans took less gold back to America than anyone ever thought they were going to. So they didn't have metalworking. Metalworking started in places where a lump of pure copper might be found lying about on the ground. The great metalworking centers of the ancient world weren't always near supplies of metal, oddly. For example, way out in the floodplains in Mesopotamia, the city of Sumer was a big metalworking industry, and they had no metal. They brought it in from the surrounding hills, possibly as far away as the Caspian Sea. But when metal came into its own, that changed a lot of things. Agriculture, obviously, but war as well. And that brings us to the Persian Empire, which is in modern-day Iran, or came from modern-day Iran, and ended up taking over everything from Iran to Iraq to Israel. They even owned Egypt, and they owned Turkey, right up to Greece. And the Bosporus, they even owned the north of the Bosporus. They owned Macedonia at one point. They tried to invade Russia, but failed at that. And then they tried to invade Greece, not once but twice. And if you count their first little piddling invasion, which wasn't, but you could call it that, then 3 times. Knocked at the door of Greece 3 times, and then were destroyed by the Greeks. The Persians were destroyed. This was in the age of bronze and some iron. In fact, the Egyptian pyramids were built using copper. That was the hardest metal they possessed, and it was very soft compared to, it's quite soft. Mixing copper with tin makes bronze. But copper itself is rather soft, and they would have, when they were chipping the limestone, they would have one guy there to chip, and then one guy to run the things to a fire, and every once in a while they would hand you a new chisel. and they would take the chisels back to a fire, heat them up, pound them nice and sharp again, and then take them back. So it's good that they were working with limestone, which is a very, very, very soft rock. So if they had one of the softest metals to work with, it's lucky they had one of the softest rocks that they were working against. Greece built its phalanx out of bronze. Now, let's see. I'll mention that the Babylonians created astronomy and wrote down vast, vast records, astronomical records, but didn't know what they were for. They thought they were messages to the gods. This information made it by, time doing what it will. It made it to the Greeks, and the Greeks studied this information very thoroughly, and they found that there were very few items in the sky that moved differently than the rest. It turned out to be 5 planets. Planetos means wanderer. There are the stars, which are fixed, and then there are these weird planets, Mars and Venus and Saturn, Mercury, Jupiter, and they move against the stars, and they move very, very oddly, in fact. Sometimes they'll turn around in reverse direction for a couple of days, particularly Mars. Then Venus and Mercury never get very far from the Sun, very oddly, and it's because they're closest to the Sun, so anytime you're looking towards Venus or Mercury, the Sun's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood. And these things were noticed by the Greeks, and they slowly began to say, these aren't gods, these are things, these are items. And rationality of a sort was sort of realized out of long studies of massive, massive records, historical records of astronomy. The Greeks brought science out of what the Babylonians thought were messages from the gods. Now, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates lived from around 450 to 250 BC or something like that. Socrates first, then Aristotle, then Plato. They did live concurrently. I don't know that Aristotle lived while Socrates was alive. He may have. I should know that. I'm sure I do know that, but certainly Socrates and Plato were around at the same time, and Plato and Aristotle certainly were around at the same time. And their philosophies, Plato's and Aristotle's, I'll just mention that Socrates never wrote a book. Everything that we have of Socrates is Plato's. Plato wrote down this stuff about Socrates. That's why there's this mild-mannered discussion about whether or not Socrates even existed, and was he just a character in Plato's dialogues. Now, their philosophy sets the stage for everything that happens up to the modern day. Plato's philosophy basically says that there's a perfect world, a heaven of some kind, or a supernatural realm of some kind, that we can't get to and don't know about. Only philosophers can get to it by using pure reason. And he is a lucky man who has the leisure to do that, and the intelligence, and the motivation to think and to learn and to be able to see. Rationality is like a sixth sense for the Greeks. It's like you have your hearing and your smell and taste, sight, whatever. But then if you can develop the sixth sense, you can see other things in the world that people are blind to, literally blind to, for the Greeks. Now, that's Plato's philosophy. Perfect world can only reach through pure reason. Aristotle's philosophy was just about diametrically opposed. There's a real world out there. The only way to find out anything about it is through sense perception. Every idea that is useful or valid in any way has to refer to reality, has to be demonstrable in physical, actual things. Very different philosophy. For Aristotle, nothing exists except the things that we can show and prove exist. For Plato, all the things that we can show and prove exist are ephemeral, not quite real, fuzzy, imperfect. There's the world of forms and the perfect heaven where there's one chair that's perfect, and one table that's perfect, and one unit of justice that's perfect, and one man that's perfect, and all of the chairs and tables and men and justices on the planet that we live on are just fuzzy implications of the heavenly perfect bodies. Well, Rome had these two philosophies offered to it, but no one really understood or grasped the grandeur of Aristotle's view. And Plato's view became very popular in the form of what we call Christianity now. It took over Rome. They believed that this world is an imperfect world. They believe that the heaven is completely perfect. They believe that the one man in heaven is God. Here's a joke for you. The Christians are so poverty-stricken, they only have one God. The Greeks were wealthy enough to have more than that. Now, Rome fell on these ideas. They lasted a long time, but they were eventually conquered by absolute savages. They tried to pay the savages off and were overrun by them after centuries of hanky-panky and nonsense. When Rome fell, it fell by being split in two, and this half being declared, when the Roman Empire is recognized to have fallen apart. It fell apart by there being a split, and Rome was declared the capital of one side, and Byzantium the other. Constantinople, Istanbul, or was it the city of Byzantium? Or is Byzantium where Constantinople in Istanbul? These are details you can look up if you're interested. But there was the eastern half and the western half, and the eastern half became the Byzantium Empire, and the western half became the Papal States, essentially, in time. Now you have the Dark Ages, and it was not a Middle Age, it was a Dark Age. Learning disappeared, literature disappeared, science and math disappeared. The last mathematician worth talking about would probably be Ptolemy, Ptolemy, from 2nd century BC in Alexandria. He was a Greek. He's probably the last mathematician worth talking about. There may be another one. The Romans may have had a mathematician or two that didn't just rehash things the Greeks had done. But that's it. That's it. Throughout all of the Dark Age, nothing happened mathematically or scientifically or literarily speaking. There were tedious things written, but nothing of use. Scripts, they actually took the script of Archimedes and wrote over it with prayers. These terrible things happened. It's called a palimpsest or something like that. Is a book that monks have taken and erased or somehow lightened the ink from the ancient world and used it to write drivel, nonsense, prayers. Terrible, terrible, terrible loss of wealth and intellectual so on. Now, the Dark Ages came to an end because all of these libraries throughout the Middle East had all of these writings from when the Greeks destroyed Persia, and they set up city-states here and there were these libraries, Greek libraries, and by, some of them, just like the Persian libraries, ended up caving in or falling or whatever. Some of them were forgotten for ages. Some of this knowledge, by and by, made its way throughout the Islamic Empire, because Islam began growing in around 600 AD and went right up to 11 or 1200, owned part of Spain. And here's where we find Europe begins to wake up. A guy named Albertus Magnus comes down from a monastery in France and brings back some books by Aristotle, about Aristotle, some commentaries on Aristotle by a guy named Aquinas. Pardon me, we're going to get to Aquinas. By a guy named Averroes, if you please. He brings back some commentaries, some stuff on Aristotle, and his student turns out to be, in this monastery, turns out to be none other than a man who was later to be canonized as a saint, Sir Thomas Aquinas, or Mr. Thomas Aquinas. He married Aristotle to faith. It was just too good, this having Aristotle after all these centuries of starvation. And he married it to, he said that faith is the handmaiden of reason. They go one in one. God gave us both these talents. Maybe he knew, maybe he didn't, that faith is the lesser of the two. In fact, faith is useless, and reason is the only thing that's useful. And to the extent anyone gets anything done, they use reason. Maybe he knew that, but he declared faith and reason to be handmaidens. Within a century, the Renaissance was there. Europe was reawakening. People were learning things again, finding out what the ancient world had, and there was an altogether orgiastic love for anything ancient. Now, Spain has this guy call on the phone, "Hey, my name's Christopher Columbus, can you give me a ship?" Actually, he went and saw the king and queen and said, "Can I get a ship?" "No, we can't, we're busy." He's on his way back to an Italian city-state, I believe. That's where he was from anyway. He's on his way back north, and they won a catastrophic major battle against the Muslims, or the Moors as they were known. Kicked them off the Iberian Peninsula. Here comes Christopher Columbus's voyage. Here's a massive army, a massive navy, military machine, lots of wealth for fighting the Muslims. All of a sudden, no project. All of a sudden, they're done. So they sent a rider north. They said, "Get that guy Christopher." Comes back Christopher. Gets on the boats, heads to America because of a major battle won against the Moors in 1492. So there you see Spain with a massive amount of wealth, contact with a vitalistic society to the south that still had some vitalism in it at the time, but was very quickly to lose that, had been losing it for a couple of centuries. You see Spain, a world power at the time, but very, very soon to fall off that with the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada shouldn't have destroyed Spain. It shouldn't have been the last act for a great power. It wouldn't have been if Spain wasn't on decline already, wasn't already in decline. It would have been just a huge cost, and they would have, built another fleet. But they didn't, because they were in decline. So the mantle had to be passed. And the British were there. The British were an island people, surrounded them by a navy. They had been invaded many times, so they did not have a long history of being this island fortress. In fact, they had a long history of being colonized. But if anyone was going to develop a self-sufficient fortress that was going to keep everybody else out, Britain, with this 22-mile moat between it and Europe, was a fine place for that to start. And that's where it started. Britain developed more of the Renaissance attitude and kept less of the Moorish attitude and the medieval and the Christian attitude. And that's why it became the harbinger of the new way in the West. That's why the vital societies all around the world, from Australia to New Zealand to South Africa to India, the really important places all around the world are British colonies, ex-British colonies, including the United States of America. So Britain became ascendant in the world for philosophical reasons, for economic reasons, but mostly for philosophical reasons. They were isolated on an island, but mostly it's philosophy. Because all those other factors were not present with other societies that became massive and most important. So there goes Britain sending its culture around the world. There goes Spain sending its culture around the world too. And then some other minor players, Denmark and whoever else, they were all trying to get their piece in. And clear up in the 1800s, Germany decides late to get into the game and try to become a colonizer, send out colonies and stuff. But Britain was early to the game. Britain and Spain, therefore, set up our paradigm for the New World. The Spanish model of an over-bureaucratized, over-militarized society. They sent people out to bring back resources, go over there, kill, maim, capture, because you're going to, after they realized it wasn't the Orient that they were in, they realized these are not Christian peoples that they're dealing with. Well, what do you do with people who aren't Christians? You make them accept Christ, you baptize them, and you cut their throat or whatever. It doesn't matter. You could kill them. They're heathens. Kill them and send them to hell. Very little remorse for what they did. Whereas the British sent people there to set up colonies and grow and be permanent settlements and to trade back and forth with England, with the mother country. Very different attitudes. The Spanish, go get stuff and bring it back. The British, go produce stuff and trade. One of them is sustainable in the long term. One of them's not. That's why today you have Canada and the United States and their very vital economies, and south of the border of the United States you have the Spanish model, and that's much less vital, isn't it? So that sets up the paradigm for the New World. Spain lands in 1492. Takes another 150 years for the British to even get to America. Then eventually they get there. 150 years after that, America rebels. Now you've got the United States taking its place among the planets of the world, so to speak. This was spoken of by Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. The United States is a new planet in the world system that's going to, soon, its gravity will soon be felt on the other planetary, on the other systems, on the rest of the system. They were right. It was to be a world power. It wasn't necessary that it become a world power, but it did become a world power because John Locke was studied extensively by the Founding Fathers. John Locke studied Aristotle extensively. The Constitution of the United States is an Aristotelian document. It is a document based on the philosophy of Aristotle, specifically, not Plato, sir. So, Aristotelian philosophy is at the basis of a recognition of the rights of man, ultimately, a recognition of reality as being important instead of the document going off and giving power to some philosopher king or some nonsense like that because he's got a view into the ethereal realm. No. It gives power to the people because why not? What's better than the people? We know from the ancient republic, from democracy in Greece, we know that the people should rule, even if they are a damn mob sometimes. And they set up a few things like senators weren't to be directly elected and so on. Even the president wasn't to be directly elected, the electoral college. So some things were set up to keep the mob from being as dangerous as they thought it could be. And in their mind, democracy was mob rule. They specifically wanted a republic, limited by a constitution. They did not want a democracy. So they set this up. And America becomes the great new nation based on Aristotelianism. Now, let's see, we're over the time limit. This was supposed to be a half-hour world history. So let me see what I can do for the history of the United States. Europe's fighting and fighting and fighting, and America has slavery. 1833, I think, or 38 or 35, in the 1830s somewhere, Britain outlaws slavery and outlaws the trading of slavery, the trading of slaves on the open seas. America took longer, right? Took another 30 years almost, 25 years for America to decide to fight a war over slavery. I will not even listen to those of you who say that it was not about slavery. It was not about states' rights. No one was fighting about states' rights, sir. It was about slavery. It was about the states' right to have slavery. That, sir, is what it was about, slavery. It was not about states' rights to distribute the water in their rivers, okay? That debate has come up today, and there's been no civil war over that. It is not about the states' rights to distribute land or kick Indians off or anything like that. Those systems, those problems have come up and gone. It was about slavery. Slavery is the only thing that can be pointed at as being the cause of the Civil War. So where Britain just outlawed it, America had a massive part of its economy based on it. 15 or 20% of our economy. Half of our land was in slave-holding states. So it was more difficult than it was in Britain. We outlawed slavery. Well, we fought a massive war over it, then outlawed it. These were good acts. These were acts of a wonderful country. Fast forward when we start doing some nasty things. 1892, the Antitrust laws are passed. No good. Terrible laws based on mob fear of industrial wealth. Back before people knew or understood that wealth is created. This is in the 1800s, very, very ignorant people. Their education system was better than ours, but some of them didn't even get educated. Some of them, not even a home education. A large number of them, the ones who did receive some education, probably knew a lot more about a lot of things than a modern person. But the point is, there was a very crude element in American society. There was a lack of education. There was a lack of knowledge about what massive, massive quantities of wealth mean. You have to understand that never before had anyone been as wealthy as the American industrialists became. I mean, no king in history had the wealth available to him that Andrew Carnegie or Pierpont Morgan or someone like this did. So, I mean, these industrialists were able to bail out countries. They were able to loan money to kings. No one had had wealth on quite this scale. There were very rich bankers in the Middle Ages. There were other cases where there were the houses of the Medici, but they got into politics inevitably. I'm talking about people who weren't in politics. They got their money from production. Had never been seen before. So nobody could grasp it. Nobody knew what was going on. Or some people did, but a lot of people didn't. The mob didn't. And that's why the antitrust laws came. That's why these people were named robber barons. That's why throughout the 1900s we had to deal with these antitrust laws, occasionally taking apart good companies and stuff like this. Through the 1950s, for example, General Motors was very careful not to gain more than 50% market share. And at one point they had about 55% of market share, and the president was in fear of going to prison over this. In the 1960s, the president of Westinghouse or GE or one of these big companies did go to prison, or was on his way to trial and killed himself, committed suicide in the police van on the way. These are horrible, horrible things done to people who are very productive. So it was a real shame that America had to go down this path. We did a couple of good things, right? We set up the world economy with we took over Japan and Germany. Then the world's biggest economy is America. We did not ask the Germans and Japanese what kind of new fascist dictators they wanted. We told them, you screwed up, you got into war with us, we won, here's your system. And this is how we describe their system to them. There will be police, courts, and a military. People will be free to start businesses. People will vote for their leaders. Their leaders will then be kicked out of office shortly, like within a few years, and new leaders will be voted for. It will not matter what leaders you get in, because the leaders will not have much power to do anything anyway. So the mob can vote in what kind of Yahoo they like, and the Yahoo can't do much. This is the system that we set up in Germany and Japan. World's biggest economy, America. Second, Japan. Third, Germany. That's not true anymore. Now China has stepped its way up through the ranks. China's number 2, Japan's number 3, Germany's number 4. But from the end of World War II, for half a century, Japan and Germany became massive players in the world economy because of the American system, the American economic system that we gave them. So the American century hasn't all been bad. There's been a few good things we did. Then there was the Antitrust Act. We divorced the dollar from gold in the 70s. And set the stage for the horrible situation we have today. You know, inflation shouldn't exist. I'll just mention this. We should have deflation. People should know that the dollar that they have today is going to buy more next week than it does today, because someone's going to invent a new factory that builds toasters better, and the price of toasters should fall. Someone's going to start a new car company, and all the other car companies are going to have to cut their prices. Prices should come down. Technology should bring them down. Competition should bring them down. Increased production should bring them down. Prices shouldn't rise. And in fact, the price of gold doesn't fall or rise. It remains steady over time. It has swings. It has swings inside of its steadiness. But over time, the price of gold is steady, and the price of money should be steady. It shouldn't increase or decrease. It should decrease slightly as productivity decreases. And that would give people an incentive to save. And that would be a much healthier economy. So it's sad that we don't have that. Well, there's the history of the world up to modern times, giving you many places to jump off and study more as you please. You can donate money to me by going to Pop Money and setting up a donation and then sending it to brandonjesse@hotmail.com. It'll notify me and I'll accept or whatever. My PayPal's closed down, so you can't do that, or it's suspended until further notice. So it's good to be back. Thank you for tuning in. Mr. Cropper signing off.